Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. In this particular part of the lesson, we're going to be answering key concept questions that show us and tell us how America came from a land and a place of distant colonies to, of course, having a constitution which centralized all power in government, which is the type of model government that we basically have today. So please listen carefully to the following audio-visual recording, and then, of course, answer the questions during and or after this presentation. Remember, if you need for clarity, you can also replay any part of this presentation or check out the link yourself of the PDF file. Let's begin. Foundations of American government. Democracy was not created in a heartbeat. In a world where people ruled by monarchs from above, the idea of self-government is entirely alien. Democracy takes practice and wisdom from experience. The American colonies began developing a democratic tradition during the earliest stages of development. And over 150 years later, the colonists believed their experience was great enough to refuse to recognize the British king. The first decade was rocky. The American Revolution and the domestic instability that followed prompted a call for a new type of government, with the Constitution to guarantee liberty. The Constitution, drafted in the early days of the independent American Republic, has endured longer than any in human history. Where did this democratic tradition truly begin? The ideas and practices that led to the development of the American Democratic Republic owe a debt to the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, the Protestant Reformation, and Gutenberg's printing press. But the Enlightenment of the 17th century Europe had the most immediate impact on the framers of the United States Constitution. So we're going to go ahead and look at that right now. The philosophies. Europeans of the 17th century no longer lived in the darkness of the Middle Ages. Ocean voyages had put them in touch with many world civilizations, and trade had created a prosperous middle class. The Protestant Reformation encouraged free thinkers to question the practices of the Catholic Church, and the printing press spread the new ideas relatively quickly and easily. The time was ripe for the philosophies. Scholars and promoted democracy and justice through discussions of individual liberty and equality. So, one of the first philosophies was Thomas Hobbes, an Englishman who concluded in his famous book Leviathan that people are incapable of ruling themselves, primarily because humans are naturally self-centered and quarrelsome and need iron fists of a strong leader. But later philosophies like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau were more optimistic about democracy. Their ideas encouraged the questioning of absolute monarchs like the Bourbon family that ruled France, and Montesquieu suggested a separation of powers into branches of government, not unlike the system Americans would later adopt. They found eager students who later became the founders of American government. John Locke. The single most important influence that shaped the founding of the United States comes from John Locke, a 17th century Englishman who redefined the nature of government. Although he agreed with Hobbes regarding the self-interested nature of humans, he was much more optimistic about their ability to use reason to avoid tyranny. In his second treatise of government, Locke identified the basis of legitimate government. According to Locke, a ruler gains authority through the consent of the governed. The duty that government is to protect the natural rights of the people, which Locke believed to include life, liberty, and property. If the government should fail to protect these rights, it's citizens who have the right to overthrow that government. This idea, deeply influenced Thomas Jefferson as he drafted the Declaration of Independence. Important English documents. Ironically, the English political system provided the grids for the revolt of its own American colonies. For many centuries, English monarchs had allowed restrictions to be placed on their ultimate power. The Magna Carta, written in 1215, established the kernel of limited government, or the belief that the monarch's rule was not absolute. Although the document only forced King John to consult nobles before he made arbitrary decisions like passing taxes, the Magna Carta provided the basis for later development of Parliament. Over the years, representative government led by Prime Minister came to control and eventually replaced the king as the real source of power in Britain. The Petition of Right extended the rights of commoners to have a voice in government. The English Bill of Rights guaranteed free elections and rights for citizens of accused crime. Although King George III still had some real power in 1776, Britain was already well along the path of democracy by that time. The foundations of American government lie squarely in the 17th and 18th century European Enlightenment. The American founders were well versed in the writings of the philosophies, whose ideas influenced the shaping of the new country. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, and others took the brave steps of creating a government based on the Enlightenment values of liberty, equality, and a new form of justice. More than 200 years later, that government is still intact. The colonial experience. So they created and nurtured them like children. The American colonies grew and flourished under British supervision. Like many adolescents, the colonies rebelled against their parent country by declaring independence. But the American democratic experiment did not begin in 1776. The colonies have been practicing limited forms of self-governing since the early 1600s. The great expanse of the Atlantic Ocean created a safe distance for American colonists to develop skills to govern themselves. Despite its efforts to control American trade, England could not possibly oversee the entire American coastline. Colonial merchants soon learned to operate outside British law. Finally, those who escaped religious persecution in England demanded the freedom to worship according to their faiths. Colonial governments. Each of the 13 colonies had a charter or written agreement between the colony and the King of England or Parliament. Charters of royal colonies provided for direct rule by the king. A colonial legislature was elected by the property-holding males, but governors were appointed by the king and had almost complete authority in theory. The legislatures controlled the salary of the governor and often used this influence to keep the governors in line with colonial wishes. The first colonial legislature was the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was established in 1619. When the first pilgrims voyaged to the New World, a bizarre twist of fate created a spirit of self-government. These pilgrims of the Mayflower were bound for Virginia in 1620, but they got lost and instead landed in Plymouth, in present-day Massachusetts. Since Plymouth did not lie within the boundaries of Virginia colony, the Pilgrims had no official charter to govern them, so they drafted the Mayflower Compact, which in essence declared that they would rule themselves. Although Massachusetts eventually became a royal colony, the Pilgrims at Plymouth set a powerful precedent for making their own rules that later reflected itself in the town meetings that were held across colonial New England. Next, let's talk about trade and taxation. Colonial economies operated under mercantilism, which is a system based on the belief that colonies existed in order to increase the mother country's wealth. England tried to regulate trade and forbid colonies from trading with other European countries. England also maintained the right to tax the colonies. Both trade and taxation were difficult for England to control, and so an informal agreement emerged. England regulated trade but allowed colonists the right to levy their own taxes. Smugglers soon exploited the English inability to guard every port by secretly trading against Parliament's wishes. This delicate agreement was put into test by the French and Indian War. The war was expensive, and from the British point of view, colonists should help pay for it, especially considering that England believed that they were protecting the colonists from French and Indian threats. The new taxes levied by the Crown nevertheless horrified the colonists. British naval measures to arrest smugglers further indicated or incited American shippers. These actions served as stepping stones to the Revolution. Religious freedom. Religious freedom served as a major motivation for Europeans to venture to American colonies. Puritans and Pilgrims in Massachusetts, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Catholics in Maryland represented the growing religious diversity in the colonies. Rhode Island was founded as a colony of religious freedom. In reaction to zealous Puritans, as a result, many different faiths coexisted in the colonies. This variety required an insistence of freedom of religion since the earliest days of British settlement. So the colonial experience was one of observing British models of government, the economy, and religion. Over the course of about 150 years, American colonists practiced these rudimentary forms of self-government that eventually led to the decision to revolt against British rule. The democratic experiment of American self-rule was therefore not a sudden change, but brought about by the Declaration of Independence. By 1776, Americans had plenty of practice. And the last page. How did we get a constitution? Independence and the Articles of Confederation. You know the sayings, no taxation without representation. These are the times that try men's souls. Give me liberty or give me death. All are famous phrases that sparked the American Revolution. In the view of many colonists, British rule suppressed political, economic, and religious freedoms. Many of those hesitated to support independence were soon convinced by the passionate words of Thomas Paine, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and eventually John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence in 1776, the American Revolution, and the creation of Articles of Confederation represent the American colonies' first attempt to become a nation. This incubation was tentative at best, but ultimately led to success. The Declaration of Independence. As tensions between Britain and the American colonies increased, a series of meetings were called, including that of the Second Continental Congress. On July 4, 1776, the delegates approved the Declaration of Independence, the event that marks the birth of the United States. So Thomas Jefferson, a delegate from Virginia, drafted the document primarily as a list of grievances against the king. His most important words, however, clearly shaped the philosophical basis of the new government. The famous introduction clearly reflected John Locke's social contract theory. To secure these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Jefferson further reasoned that since the British government had abused these rights, the colonists had the right to alter and to abolish it, or to institute a new government. The American Revolution and the Articles of Confederation. So the British, of course, did not recognize the Declaration and continued to send troops to contain the rebellion. The war continued until 1783, so the new government had to be put in place in a wartime atmosphere. The Articles of Confederation, a compact among the 13 original states, was written in 1776 but not ratified by the states until 1781. The loose league of friendship that it created reflected the founders' reaction to the central authority of King George III. The government gave most powers to the states, and central government consisted only of legislature. Above all the colonists wanted to preserve their liberties, but the central government's lack of power proved to be disastrous. It could not regulate trade or keep states from circulating their own currency, no chief executive could make real decisions, and no national court could settle disputes among states. And perhaps most importantly, they could not efficiently conduct a war nor pay debts incurred once the war was over. So by 1786, the new country was in serious economic straits, and states were quarreling over boundary lines and tariffs, and economic depression left not only states in trouble, but also many ordinary citizens such as farmers and merchants. They were deep in debt as well. So Shays' Rebellion happened, which is a revolt by angry farmers in Massachusetts, symbolized the chaos in the country. Even though the Massachusetts militia finally put the rebellion down, it pointed out the inability of the central government to maintain law and order. In reaction, Alexander Hamilton of New York initiated the organization of a meeting in Philadelphia in 1787. This convention would eventually throw out the Articles of Confederation and draft the Constitution. So the freedom that American Revolution sought to preserve proved to create a government under the Articles of Confederation that could not keep law and order. But the failure of the initial experiment helped the founders to find a more perfect balance between liberty and order in the Constitution they produced in 1787. So there you guys have it. That's the story of early American government. Please remember to answer the key concept questions in the Google Doc and then submit accordingly. Please also be advised that it's always good to be detailed in your answers because we will be picking and pulling from this site and, of course, these questions later on. Thank you very much.